The New Babylon, Chapter 9. Bryce and his wife walked quietly up toward the small house. They walked on the grass just adjacent to the gravel and dirt driveway, as not to make any noise. Bryce peered into the living room window from outside on the porch. He smiled and looked at his wife. "Bear, want to have some fun with these knuckleheads?" he asked her playfully. "Whatever you're planning to do, big man, before you do it, let me take cover. You're liable to get us shot, and I just walked too far to die here and now." Bryce snickered. "I suppose you're right, hon, but still, you're no fun at all." She gave him a quick slap on the arm, and he snickered again. "For me," she said, "fun these days is staying alive." She knocked on the door and opened it slowly, announcing them before entering. When Bryce saw Bart, he looked at him and said, "Hey, Flatfoot, I'm surprised to see you found the place, seeing as there was no giant searchlight shining up from the roof." Bart quickly retorted, "Yeah, the only way you were able to find it was from following me here. Heck, you were so close to my six at one point, I knew if I stopped quick, you'd done run right into my rear end. Didn't they ever teach you nothing about maintaining a discreet distance?" Both men laughed out loud, and Bryce threw open wide his arms. Bart did the same, and the two men embraced. Bart grabbed Bryce's head and gave him a big kiss square in the lips. They embraced again. Bryce pulled out of the hug and said, "Man, it's good to see you, brother." Bart just nodded and pulled his friend back in for another hug. "You too, brother, you too. You remember Katie," he said as he turned to look at his wife. Bryce looked over at her, and Bear was already hugging her. "I do. Last time I saw her was on the day she made the biggest mistake of her life. It was just before y'all left on your honeymoon, as I recall." Bart smiled and shook his head. Bryce leaned in and put his arms around her, as she and Bear were still hugging. "It's good to see you, Kate." Bryce threw his hand forward to shake and said, "Pete? Johnny?" Bryce just looked at them. Bear came over to them and hugged them both. She stepped back and looked at them too. "Smile, boys," she said. "Any friends of Bart's is friends of ours too." She smiled at her husband. Bryce looked over at the large man seated at the table. He nodded and addressed him. "Hey, Arby, how's it going?" he asked. "Good. Going good, brother," Arby responded. Arby lived here in this house with his wife until she passed away a few months back. Arby, whose name really wasn't Arby, said, "Glad y'all made it in safely, Bryce." Bryce and Arby met several years earlier at a prepper meetup, halfway between where the two men lived in central Pennsylvania. They met for lunch at an Arby's restaurant. Arby was nervous about the meeting, and he had known Bryce to that point only from an online prepper group to which both men belonged. When Bryce arrived at the restaurant, he asked Arby why he wanted to meet there. Arby nervously started rambling about how the double stacked cheeseburgers were his favorite burger, and he wouldn't stop. He said he just loved Arby's, and he stopped there every chance he got. He was sweating profusely and just rambling on and on. After his nerves settled down, the two men had a very productive meeting, and they left with arrangements to meet again in 1 month's time. When Bryce walked into the diner where they were set to meet, he walked up to the counter when he saw his new friend. He stuck out his hand to shake and said, "Hey, Arby, how's it going, brother?" He was Arby ever since. Will, Bryce, Bart, and Kevin had all served together during the original Desert Storm conflict in 1991. The combat phase of the war only lasted 1 month, but the unit that they all served in was there for a total of 21 months. The four men formed an unbreakable bond during their time serving together, a bond as strong as iron. iron forged in the crucible of combat. When they returned home after the war, the four men remained close. The war changed them. It opened their eyes to conditions in other countries, made them take stock of what we all enjoyed here, what we enjoyed because of the freedoms that we had. It changed them in other ways, too. As a direct result of their personal experiences there, all four men had been changed forever. They met in Paris Island in basic training. Afterwards, they deployed along with the rest of their unit to the Middle East. They were in the 21st month of a 24-month deployment when they were being inserted into a village outside of Kandahar province. When a convoy of Taliban fighters opened fire on them with RPGs and small arms fire, the two helicopters carrying the 10-man team sustained heavy damage. The lead helo took a direct hit from an RPG and began to spin out of control, losing altitude rapidly. When the fuel in the tanks exploded, the concussion caused the second chopper to tilt and drop to the side, causing it to lose control. Before the pilot could regain control of his gunship, the right landing skid caught a rocky outcropping above the desert floor and spun it into the ground in a violent crash. Kevin, Bart, Will, and Bryce were the only four survivors. The other 6 teammates, as well as both pilots, were killed in the incident. Bryce sustained several injuries, including a broken leg. Bart sustained a pretty bad shoulder injury as well. Bart had a handheld comms unit that he was able to use to make contact with an extradition team that was searching for them the next day, but not before they had to walk for 12 miles and spend one miserable night in the desert. Will and Kevin had to carry Bryce, while Bart, with only one arm, managed to provide the team with security during their arduous hike. When they returned home, Bart and Bryce were both discharged from service due to the injuries they sustained in the crash. Kevin and Will were reassigned with their unit together and served out the rest of their obligation. The incident probably had the most impact on Bart. He disengaged from his family and friends and from society in general. After his return home, he didn't want to talk to or see anyone. To accomplish this, he embarked on a hike that took him the entire distance of the Appalachian Trail, starting in Springer Mountain, Georgia, and completing the nearly 2,200-mile trek on Mount Katahdin in northern Maine. Bart grew up in Georgia, not far from the trailhead that was the starting point for the AT. As a teen and young man, he and his friends spent a fair amount of time on the trail. Bart went on to be a trail maintainer and an avid hiker. He hiked a total of 1,100 miles before he was deployed, a section at a time. Now he was determined to thru-hike the entire trail. If he didn't meet or talk to a single soul along the way, that would suit him just fine. Bart had a bit of an extroverted personality. He could talk to anyone, anywhere, often to the dismay of his friends and family. But in that time, he just wanted solitude. He just wanted to be alone. Pete and Johnny were good men. They were loyal to Bart. They thought it was crazy to head in the opposite direction from a well-stocked, well-located retreat to go, of all places, into New York City. They had voiced this opinion to Bart during discussions they had when Will presented them with the scenario. In the end, Will, Bryce, and Bart had their minds made up. They were going for Kevin, and that was that. Pete and Johnny discussed it privately, and in the end, they decided to stay with Bart. The three had grown up together and were the best of friends. Will's group was a pretty tight, cohesive team that he himself handpicked. The 4 men and their wives were the core members. Will's wife passed away from a rare form of bone cancer 2 years earlier. He was left to raise the kids alone. Will, Bryce, and Kevin had only met Pete and Johnny once before, and briefly at that. Bart had brought them up for group membership. The fact that he vouched for them strongly got them a spot on the team. It was hard for Will. He moved slowly and cautiously in every aspect of his prepping endeavors. In the end, however, he voted with the others to admit the 2 men, mainly because he saw how important it was to Bart. Will had a sister and brother-in-law in West Texas that were part of the group as well. Before he left, he received word from them that they were okay and on their way to the retreat. Bryce unrolled the area map out on a long wooden table in the cabin. He pointed to an intersection of a secondary road and a railroad track. "Here's point A on the primary plan," he said. Then he pointed to a dotted line on the map which signified a dirt road. "Here, coming in from the west, is point B from the backup plan. Will is going to radio in when he reaches whichever of those points he comes in on. The primary plan is the shortest route if he can make it." Bart sensed the tension in Bryce's voice. "Do you suspect he ran into trouble?" Bart asked Bryce. Bryce responded, "Well, no, not really. I just thought he would have been here by now. But projecting the rate of travel from the distance isn't an exact science. So many things could have slowed him down, even if he wasn't forced to go on one of the contingency routes." Bart put his hand on his friend's shoulder. "Don't sweat it yet, brother. If anyone can make it, my money's on William," Bart assured Bryce. Bryce just nodded. Bart told Bryce, "I saw a house a few miles up the road on the way in that was wired for cable. I could go back and see how much RG6 I can scrounge up. I can probably rig something up for an antenna and get it mounted up in the tree outside to reach out a little further. Try to raise them on comms." Bryce shook his head. "Nah, that won't do any good. You know Will. He won't go against protocols and break radio silence until he gets to the designated point. We got a loop mounted on the chimney. We should pick him up with that at that distance." Bart grimaced. "Yeah, old Will's a stickler for OPSEC. I guess we just wait." Bryce nodded in agreement. Bryce walked out and sat on the porch and lit a cigarette. A minute later, Bear came out and sat beside him. She put her arm around her husband's shoulders. "They'll be okay, baby," she smiled. Bryce smiled back. "Yeah," and he hugged his wife. She looked out into the dark night, wondering if she even believed it herself. "Why don't we leave Pete and Johnny here with Arby, and me, you, and Bart backtrack up the route to meet Will and the kids?" she asked. Bryce just shook his head. "Nah, we don't know if he was forced to switch to the backup route or even have to come up with a whole new plan. No, we stick to the protocols and stay put and wait." Every day they were forced to wait made it more difficult to follow those protocols. The group had planned every scenario down to the last detail. In their heads they knew what to do, but in their hearts they wanted to take action. Any action. Just to be able to do something would be better than just sitting here waiting. But waiting is exactly what they needed to do. Back in Queens, Kevin sat on the roof of the church, looking up at the stars. He was thinking of his friends. He thought about Will and Bart and Bryce. He thought about the families that he knew would be with them. He was torn. He had a commitment to them. They had planned for a life-changing event. They saw firsthand the direction the nation was heading, the collision course it was on with itself. They were a tight-knit group. They had been prepping and training together for years. They bought the land and built the camp that became their retreat together. They worked there regularly, and they set it up and stocked it well. There were protocols in place to meet up and travel there together. Kevin knew in his heart that when he lost communication with them, that they would come for him. He knew no matter what, they would not leave him, Sarah, and Grace behind. At the same time, he was serving an important function here with the church group as well. He hadn't planned it, but when the system collapsed, he just fell into it. And as the situation progressed, and Sarah and Grace took on main roles on the medical team, Kevin felt a responsibility here as well. A responsibility to these people who accepted his family and gave them safe haven with them. These people who fed and cared for them. How could Kevin leave this place? He went over the radio scenario 100 times in his head. How could he not have bought a backup radio? How could he be so careless? The truth of the matter was, he always knew he needed one. There were always just more important things to buy, higher priority items. He worked within the confines of the budget that he had the best he could. He stared out into the night. Where were his friends at this very moment? Were they on their way here already? Inside, he hoped they just went on to the camp without him. But deep down, he knew they would come for him. Just then, a loud, shrill siren broke the dead silence of the dark night. A light turned on and lit the block in front of the church as the siren wailed. Kevin stood up and started for the window, leading back into the church tower. He ran down the spiral stairs, headed for the door and the street beyond.